Hello everyone, John Monroe here, one of the instructors on the Global Cold War module at the University of Birmingham this term, and I'm here at the Edgbaston Reservoir in Birmingham. Let me show you if you haven't been here before. It's early in the morning, sun's not quite up, and it's cloudy. So I'm here to give the lecture for week 4, Two Sides of the Iron Curtain. And one thing that I learned in the pandemic experience about offering lecture content digitally is that in some ways it frees us up. It frees me up to record the lecture somewhere other than just sitting at my computer. And maybe it frees you up a little bit to see something more interesting than just me rambling on. So I will undoubtedly ramble, but nonetheless, I thought I have my bicycle here. I thought I would go on a bike ride around the reservoir and maybe back towards the city center and along the canal a little bit as a more kind of maybe interesting, maybe fun way to talk to you about the two sides of the Iron Curtain that we're considering this week in week 4. So let me turn the camera around. It's on a head strap, so it's just kind of like basically at my forehead, looking where I'm looking. Put on my helmet over top. It's cloudy, but there's a strip of clear sky down there. Maybe a little bit of the sunlight will come out as I ride. Okay, so the Edgbaston Reservoir, here we go. So this week's lecture, as you know, is on the two sides of the Iron Curtain. And so I want to start not by assuming the Iron Curtain is something that that is just an unproblematic description of Europe or of global politics after 1945. Hope this wind isn't too strong. Hopefully it'll die down. So rather than accept the Iron Curtain as a fact, rather, as we're doing in this class, with the whole idea of the Cold War in general, we want to unpack it a little bit and kind of analyze what some of its assumptions are, and maybe think about some other ways of thinking about the topic as well. Okay, so as we've already seen, the idea of the Iron Curtain is a very powerful metaphor for the Cold War. And of course, it comes to us from Winston Churchill. And there are many opinions about Winston Churchill, as you know. One thing I think that isn't in dispute is that he gives us, some pretty important, memorable speeches and images in the mid-20th century. Obviously, some of his World War II speeches about the RAF or about fighting the Nazis on the beaches if they invade and so on. And then in 1946, on a trip in the United States in Fulton, Missouri, he provides this image of an Iron Curtain having descended on Europe, enclosing some of the great old capitals of Eastern Europe under communist domination, etc. So this week's lecture is about, and as you see in the Odd Arnie Wested readings that are assigned, Eastern spheres and the making of the West, we have a basically description of this situation. But what I want us to do again is to think critically about this. So this metaphor of the Iron Curtain is powerful. It very quickly evokes an idea of two worlds separated by, again, a curtain of iron, a pretty impermeable kind of and strong substance. But actually, there's a few different ways we want to think about this. One, as we've already talked about, if we use the metaphor of the compass, the Iron Curtain idea very much draws us into thinking about a global divide along east and west lines. And of course, north and south is just a whole other way that we can think about this. So we'll want to do that as we're thinking about the Iron Curtain, as we're thinking about worlds east and west, the communist second world and the capitalist first world. And here we're really talking about the capitalist first world, kind of the North Atlantic segment of that, led by the United States. We're also going to want to think about how those two kind of global North formations are in a significant and ongoing relationship with the global South as well. So that's the first way we want to think critically about this. Another way, oh, we have a nice, look at this view, sunrise over Birmingham. So another way we want to think critically about the idea of the Iron Curtain is to think about the Cold War as a kind of one overarching way of understanding, again, world politics after World War II. But there's something about the idea of the Cold War, and other historians have said this, that as you get closer to the ground, as you get to more micro levels, and looking at people's lived experience in different locations, the idea of the Cold War sort of has less and less purchase. So let me give you point you to a couple of books that I've found that have been pretty useful in thinking through this if you want to follow this idea a bit further. Edith Schaeffer's book, Burned Bridge, is about the inner border, so we might say along the Iron Curtain, to continue the metaphor, the inner border between the Federal Republic of West Germany and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. As you know, there was the division in Berlin. The Berlin Wall goes up in '61, and then there also was the border between the two states that ran north-south through Germany. And so what Schaeffer does is she looks at these two communities at this crossing, Burned Bridge, these two small towns, and looking close up, yes, the border was there, and yes, an East and West German kind of identity did kind of come into existence and become somewhat entrenched over time. But also at the same time, the border was much more porous than the idea of the Iron Curtain might lead you to believe. People might wander across, teenagers out on an adventure might sneak across. There's a variety, and the two communities interacted in different ways across this divide over the Cold War decades. Just on your left. Thank you. And so looking close up, there's another good book, Yulia Komska's The Icon Curtain, it's called. And this is a study of, again, a segment of what we might call the Iron Curtain. This time along the West German, I guess it would be Bavarian, Czechoslovakian border. And she's looking there at the ways that some of the Germans along that border had lived on the Czech side in what was called the Sudetenland before World War II. And this continues to be something of a borderland. And there are ways in which people are thinking across the border, imagining it through religion, culture. Again, there's a local story to be told that when you do that, as Komska says, it makes the idea of the Iron Curtain, a singular Iron Curtain, make less and less sense. Thank you. So those are a couple of ways in which we want to think critically about the idea of the Iron Curtain in general, rather than just simply accept it as reality. Okay, so following our reading this week from Westad, let me say a little bit about, we'll get into the details in the lecture session in class, but let me in this online lecture say a little bit about, well, first let me give you a bit more of a view of the sunrise here. It's beautiful. Very nice. So let me say a bit about the East and a bit about the West to sort of parallel what we've read about. But again, what I want to do is hopefully think critically again about the relationship between what we might call the two Norths and the global South. Okay, so in terms of the communist world then, extending from Central Europe to Vladivostok, and then after 1949 also extending into the global South with the establishment of the People's Republic of China, led by Mao Zedong and his Communist Party of China colleagues. So this was a world of planned economies, of very heavy state involvement in society. Okay, I gotta go up this hill, so I might need to catch my breath. This is bringing us back to where I started, but I'm gonna continue on towards the city center. So, and so Westad talks about this apparent contradiction, or at least tension, in communist thought between the pull of class and the pull of nation. So, as you know, and as we've talked about, Marxism is a critical view of class relations in capitalist society. Those who own, those who do not and have to sell their labor to the capitalists. So what this means, as we've also talked about, is that class interests then are not especially nation-based. They're transnational. Marx and Engels say this in the Communist Manifesto, that the workers have no country. They have their class alliances and allegiances and interests, even if they don't always recognize them. So for workers in Poland and workers in France, for instance, their situation is one in which, if both are under capitalism, they have something much more in common than their Polish or French nationality. But of course, what happens is, with the Russian Revolution in 1917, communism comes into existence in a particular country. It doesn't come into existence, though some had hoped, in revolutions across the capitalist world. So what this means, and what Westad is talking about, is that communists in charge of, I'm going to cross at the light here, in charge of communist countries are in charge of nations, and so they are not necessarily ruling in terms of only class interest, but also the interest of a particular nation as well. So in the Russian example, maybe World War II is a good example of this. So in the Russian example, the Soviet example, World War II becomes known as the Great Patriotic War, and that tells us something about this tension. Rather than the Great, say, Proletarian War, we have clearly a kind of Russian or even Soviet nationalism being mobilized against the Nazi invasion. And this also plays out in terms of the memory of the war in the Soviet Union, and indeed to this day in post-Soviet Russia. So, and we can see examples of this in other communist countries. So we want to keep this in mind as well. Whoa. That there's a tension between nation and class when we're thinking about the communist second world. Okay, I'm on a bit of busy roads here, but this won't last too long. I'm making my way into the city center and towards the canal, which will be quieter again. So looks like we got some traffic. Okay, I'll just go slow. So in these societies in which the state played a very, very large role, again, planning the economy, cracking down on dissent, was a particular feature of capital C communist societies. Secret police, detention, expulsion, purges, executions, gulags, you know, a whole range of repressive techniques. So what did this mean for people living in these societies in terms of resistance? And Westad takes this up a little bit as well. It meant that resistance was very difficult, but it also did not mean that resistance did not take place, which it certainly did. And it happened in a number of ways. People would, you know, one example is sort of people escaping into private life, essentially, just trying to almost in some ways think about something else, and just kind of get on with the other business of living. More kind of formally political, resistance could happen in outbreaks, and we see this in the readings, a couple of examples of this. So in 1953, in the German Democratic Republic, there's a workers' uprising, which again, this is contrary to what's supposed to happen in a communist society where the state is ruling on behalf of the workers. Here you have dissatisfaction with communist rule, and particularly dissatisfaction with working conditions. And this was one of the big issues in communist societies in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, an emphasis on industrial production often left working people and consumers feeling dissatisfied, because people just don't want to just, you know, there's only so much satisfaction one can get about steel production quotas in the society in which you live. People want more than that. And so there's also a way in which this workers' uprising in 1953 in the GDR kind of exemplifies the difficulties for communist regimes when the people of these societies, and again in the German case, workers, are dissatisfied. And of course, not surprisingly, this uprising is put down. And there are other, you know, kind of rumblings of rebellion across the communist world at many different moments. But the most significant one in the period that we're looking at this week, and we're kind of talking mostly about the 50s and a little bit into the 1960s, is the uprising in Hungary in 1956. So this is a major event. Thank you. So first, to set the background for this, of course, I guess maybe the most important background event is the death of Stalin in 1953. And we mentioned this last time in our lecture session in week 2. In week 3, sorry. And so Stalin's death in 1953 is, of course, a momentous event. Stalin, in many ways, you know, authoritarian figure that he was, serves a kind of function of holding together the Soviet regime in many ways. You know, there's the cult of personality. He doesn't just happen to be the leader. He's extremely important, and the images of him are extremely important for legitimating the communist system. Okay, getting onto the canal here. So his death in 1953 opens up some questions in a few different ways. It opens up a question of what kind of society is going to follow. A little bit like how we talked about before in Stalin's own election speech right after World War II, he's addressing a kind of question of what kind of society is the Soviet Union going to be after the great test that was World War II. And his answer is, as we also saw, essentially more of the same. Here, with Stalin now gone, this opens up the question of what kind of, how heavy-handed is Stalinism going to be without Stalin himself? Is there going to be opportunity for more open expression? Is there going to be a greater emphasis on consumer goods? What's it going to be like? It also, secondly, opens the question of who's going to take over after Stalin. So Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the secret police, brutal figure, he's one who's in the standing there. And again, in the film The Death of Stalin, the comedic take, which is a film, it's definitely worth watching because it gives you, you know, one way into thinking about this topic. And Steve Buscemi's performance as Nikita Khrushchev is its own sort of reward. But you know, it's a comedy, so obviously it's going to be a distortion in some ways. But also, there's something about that film for me that the way that it sort of critiques, but also revels in my reading, the sexism of Stalin and his fellow leaders. Just coming up on your right. Whoops. Just passing on your right. Thank you. One way you might want to contrast this is by looking at the film footage of Stalin's funeral itself. And a few different kind of sort of documentary films have been made about this that are quite interesting, but the footage itself is just something to behold. The critic Sophie Pinkham has written insightfully about this, and also notes that one of the things that makes the footage of Stalin's funeral so notable is the color stock. Thank you. The color stock film that the Soviets have, which they had acquired upon conquering Germany at the end of World War II. But what's interesting about that footage is it shows that Stalin was certainly an autocrat, but it shows that there was very genuine bereavement and concern on the part of at least some Soviet people, and not just in Moscow, but across the Soviet Union. There's the funeral sort of itself, but then there are different sort of public markings of Stalin's death in cities around the Soviet Union. Okay, so this opens the question of what's going to happen. And so the Hungarians answer this question by rising up in 1956. And symbolically, they topple a statue of Joseph Stalin. Imre Nagy, the Hungarian leader, who had just recently become the leader in communist Hungary, ultimately sides with the rebellion, which is crushed by Soviet tanks, and he himself is executed. So again, like the GDR in 1953, the workers' uprising there, this tells us that state repression is serious. State capacity to put down open rebellion is formidable, and there's not going to be a successful uprising that's going to overthrow communist rule from within. The Hungarians, Nagy himself, hoped perhaps for some support or response from the West, but it wasn't forthcoming, and that in no way should surprise us. There is no chance that Eisenhower, president at this point, that Dwight Eisenhower was going to commit U.S. forces to counter Soviet tanks within the Eastern Bloc. This would, I mean, who knows where that would have led, but obviously one of the places that might have led would have been to direct atomic war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So that was not something that Eisenhower would have contemplated. Despite some of his rhetoric, and definitely some of the rhetoric within the McCarthyite period, about a desire to roll back rather than just simply contain communism. Okay, so resistance does take place within the Soviet sphere. Let's see. And this leads to so a crackdown, but at the same time it also leads to what's called in the Soviet 50s and into the 60s the thaw under Khrushchev's leadership. So there is an opening. Political prisoners are released en masse from the Gulag system, for example. There is more freedom of expression within limits. The cult of personality is toned down considerably. Khrushchev does not play the kind of symbolic role that Stalin did. And perhaps the best example of this is what's called the secret speech. It's not very secret, but Khrushchev gives this speech, which we'll be looking at in class, in which he condemns Stalin's rule, its autocratic nature, and his criticisms. Again, we'll talk about this, and I'll be interested to hear your perspective on it. His criticisms are quite stern. It's not just a few mild rebukes. It really is a pointed set of criticisms of you know, the great teacher and leader and so on, as he had been called before. Okay, so let me see here. I need to stop for a second. I made a couple of notes. I want to make sure I cover everything I wanted to talk about. Yeah, so the last thing I want to say before I turn to the West is, and by the way, you'll see I made a couple of notes on my handlebars, which is kind of fun. So the other thing then is just to think about in terms of the planned economy, the failures that it encountered, and then also some of the, you know, some raising of standard of living within Soviet society. The question of gender in the Soviet world is an interesting one, in that the position of women in the Soviet Union, but also in other communist societies, China included, the position of women improves in many ways, certainly symbolically. There's quite a bit of rhetoric on what communists called the women question, and quite a lot of thinking about this from, from communist, feminist figures, Alexandra Kollontai and others. Clara Zetkin come to mind. So, so opportunities for women improve under the terms of communism from a baseline of, you know, pretty rigid patriarchal kind of circumstances before. But also women are, we might say, more liberated, and of course very much said about liberating themselves from housework and are taking part in the economy and society, education at many levels, though notably not at the leadership level, or almost never. And so, but this also doesn't necessarily liberate women from duties of the household. And so, as Westad points out, as in the West, women are often burdened with more to do, while also taking part in a much wider array of the activities of the society under communist rule. And the last thing I'll say is just to mention Sputnik, the launching of the first satellite into space. It's so interesting because we think now about how important satellites are with our phones and the internet and everything else, and the ways that satellites are just, you know, we don't see them necessarily, but they're an everyday part of our world. And it was a communist society that launched the first one. This doesn't necessarily mean that, as John F. Kennedy tried to argue, that the Soviets were pulling way ahead of the United States in terms of various capacities. Kennedy was more focused on military, but it did certainly frighten the United States in terms of the Cold War moving into a kind of extraplanetary level. And at the same time, it also had important implications for the West in terms of education. The public university in the United States was much more robustly funded in the wake of Sputnik, because there was this sense of a desire to catch up and get ahead of Soviet advances. Okay, so those are some words about the Second World. I've said less about China here, and again, this is partly following Westad's sort of focus on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And we talked quite a bit about China last time, and obviously it will continue to be a very important player here. I mean, I guess I'll just mention that one of the main events in the Chinese 1950s is the Great Leap Forward, which is, you know, Mao's attempt to kind of race ahead, following a kind of Marxist script of stages of history, and in short, it proves quite disastrous in many ways, and large-scale famine is one of the worst results of it. Okay, so let's turn to the West a little bit, and I think this is probably a bit more familiar, so I'll say less about it. So a couple of points here. I talked about how there was a kind of tension in communist thought between class and nation. There is also a tension between class and nation within, we might say, capitalist ideology, in that in terms of a kind of idealized liberal, classical liberal view of capitalism, think Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations, published back in 1776, you know, there's a kind of idea, and very much this sort of liberal, I mean, here I am riding around Birmingham. This was Birmingham, and even more Manchester were kind of symbols of this ideology. A laissez-faire, light touch of the state, letting business people get on with the work of you know, generating wealth and so on. Well, of course, even under the terms of classical liberalism, the state plays a pretty important role in a capitalist society. Just ask workers who rebel against their conditions. The state can be brought in to you know, put them back to work or what have you. Think about the role of militaries, and then more benign stuff like public education, and healthcare, other kinds of more mid-20th century phenomena are really important in the capitalist world, and they're really important in Western Europe in particular. So we also have, on the one hand, a kind of acceptance on the part of the United States, whose welfare state never becomes as developed, you know, think healthcare, never becomes as developed as that of many of the societies of Western Europe. The New Deal in the 1930s into the 40s is kind of one of the high point expressions of as far as it'll go. There's Lyndon Johnson's Great Society later, but basically, just passing on your right. Thank you. But there's an acceptance for, I mean, what many would call socialism under a capitalist, I mean, a kind of social democratic is a better way to put it, because it's not collective ownership, but rather a role for the state in moderating a capitalist society, essentially. So think Britain, the British welfare state, as a kind of example of this. And this is somewhat, not quite at odds, but there's a bit of a tension between the social democratic idea and the idea of capitalism under the United States. So this is one of the ideological tensions. Excuse the noise. That the Cold War brings about, and the United States is not going to oppose social democracy in Europe, because obviously that's a much better option than having than having a possibility of communist inroads, particularly as we've talked about in places like Italy and France, where communist parties are very legitimate and quite powerful part of the political landscape. Okay, so another thing that WestEd emphasizes, which I'll mention, is again this idea of the West really coming into not coming into existence, but becoming more entrenched and more of a real sort of reality for people living in Western Europe and in the United States. So it's US led, it's not surprising. Think about the Marshall Plan and the role that the US plays in getting the Western European kind of economies back up and running. So it's about an integration of the North Atlantic system with the US at the lead, and junior partners like Britain, France, and others, you know, in different sort of places within it. It's also a story of integration of Europe itself, leading to the EEC and ultimately the EU of today. And we also want to think about this, again, to come back to my point earlier about global north, global south, when we're thinking about east-west, is we might want to think about European integration and the integration of the North Atlantic system in the context of imperialism, because we know that decolonization is happening. And there might be a temptation to think that decolonization is happening sort of off stage and in ways that don't greatly impact Europe and the United States. This is not true, and this is something I want to sort of guard against. And there's a way of thinking about East-West that sort of already predisposes us to think that imperialism might not be so important. So there's two ways in which I want to signal this. One, decolonization matters for Northern Europe and for the United States, but particularly those powers that had large formal empires, again, Britain and France at the top of the list. So this was both a kind of political downgrading of status, just clearly with the loss from their point of view of their colonies, and it also has cultural and almost kind of nationally psychological ramifications. So there's a way in which British, for example, British politics are hugely impacted, and they very much are to this day, in terms of the British coming to terms with the decline of its empire. So this is something we want to think about. But there's another way to think about it too, and that's that decolonization doesn't mean the end of relationships between global North and global South. We can think of the end of formal the end of formal colonialism, and the onset of what the first Prime Minister of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, called neo-colonialism. A kind of situation in which the formal relations of rule are over. The Union Jack has come down, the Ghanaian flag in this example has gone up. But nonetheless, the economies of the global South find themselves very much geared towards the old imperial system. So there's ways that informal colonial rule can continue after formal decolonization has taken place. And if we see that to today, think about global South debt crises and so on, the extraction of resources from the global South, there's all kinds of ways in which this continues to today. So if we think about the European story, we can't think about it separately. We can't think about it only in East-West terms, and we can't think about it separately from what's going on in terms of relations between global North and global South. Okay, so I also just wanted to mention the cultural, thank you. Oh, sorry, thanks a lot. The cultural power of the United States in this moment. WestEd has a nice line. He says that American and British teenagers, or American and European teenagers, were more united by Brando than NATO, which has a nice ring to it. I would point to James Dean too as another, who's mentioned as another important figure here. And if you've seen the film Rebel Without a Cause, you'll know what I mean. If you haven't, check it out. This 1955 film about rebellious teenagers, with James Dean in the role of his character Jim Stark and his kind of teen angst and anxiety, alongside his friends Judy and Plato. And there's a way in which this film, you know, you can watch it as these are teenagers who have access to cars and live middle-class white lifestyles in the affluent United States. But also we can watch the film as a critique of the ways in which that kind of society is not satisfying for even some of its privileged members. Okay, so this isn't, but it's also thinking about watching Rebel Without a Cause in the European context, just simply the displays of affluence in a society, watching in societies in Europe that were rebuilding from the war, also maybe gives us a sense of the ways that the United States would have been seen as a powerful and attractive kind of icon of modes of living after World War II. So just one example of this cultural power that's intangible, but that's very important at the same time. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about here is within the West. It's connected to the theme of imperialism that I just mentioned, but this idea, and I want to counter our reading from Odd Arnie Westad here a bit. He talks about kind of the people who are left out, or the people who are left behind in the affluent society of the United States. And he points particularly to women and African Americans. And so I want to suggest that maybe another way of thinking about this is to think about women and African Americans within 1950s US society as not so much left out or left behind, but as structurally located in ways that make that affluence possible. So the domestic work of women being a clear example of this, the domestic housewife making the suburban setup possible, the ways that Jim Crow segregation was, of course, a racial system, but also an economic system. If we think about 1950s affluence in the United States, suburbanization comes quickly to mind. Now, if we think about how suburbanization worked and how the construction of motorways, freeways as they're called in the US, connected cities to suburbs, we also then want to ask where those freeways were built. And they were often built right through African American communities. So this isn't an example so much of African Americans left behind as rather a structure of racial oppression that's deeply connected to the capitalist setup in the US. And the last thing I'll leave us with here is a historiographical debate. Catching my breath as I go up this hill. A historiographical debate about the relationship between the Cold War and the African American civil rights movement. So this is an ongoing and deeply felt debate because it has so much political kind of resonance for today. So I'm gonna just give you a quick sense of the two views, and maybe in class we can talk a little bit about which one sounds like it makes more sense to you. So the debate, to put it in shorthand, is essentially around whether the Cold War was good or bad, whether it aided or impeded the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. So one view, that the Cold War was helpful to the civil rights movement, suggests that, again, looking at this, thank you, in a global view, suggests that, because the Soviet Union was so good at playing up the racial contradiction within the United States, in which the United States claimed to be a force for freedom in the world, while Jim Crow segregation and many examples of white supremacist racial violence, police brutality, and so on took place, meant that the US government, under Eisenhower and even more under Kennedy, had to take this seriously because the decolonizing world was at stake. And so grudgingly even, Eisenhower, at a crucial moment, there's the Little Rock, Arkansas school crisis is one instance of this, and Eisenhower, to put it again in short form, comes to the aid. It's not quite accurate, but just to summarize, comes to the aid of the civil rights movement in a particular way, and a big part of this is because of the international pressure that he doesn't want the forces of old South open white supremacy to kind of damage the U.S. image on the world stage. So this is one way in which the Cold War proves helpful to the civil rights movement. The other view suggests something very different, that in fact the Cold War was a disaster for the prospects for African American freedom in the following way. Coming out of World War II, many African American leaders, intellectuals, movement, people involved in the movement, and just many African Americans and not African Americans alone, felt that in order to overcome the system of Jim Crow segregation, because of the ways that race and class and gender, for that matter, are intertwined, though this was more conversation about race and class usually, meant that this was going to mean an economic restructuring for the United States as well. And that this restructuring was going to be connected to international events, namely decolonization. So this was going to be part of a global challenge to ideologies of white supremacy and capitalist relations, even if not explicitly anti-capitalist in sort of intent. There definitely was a whole series of ideas and articulations that the end of Jim Crow would need to mean some kind of end of the way that the capitalist system works in the United States. So the March on Washington in 1963, catching my breath again, that Martin Luther King, where Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Justice as well. So there's a way that there, one example of this economic vision at work. But the reason why numerous scholars have argued and continue quite compellingly to argue that the Cold War was a negation of the prospects of full black liberation is that this economic component was really drowned out through the rhetoric and politics of anti-communism, as well as the international view. So W.E.B. Du Bois is the scholar and activist, is a good example of this. Him and others whose careers were quite damaged, and whose political kind of influence was not as great as it might have been because of these very dynamics. So why was this so bad? Because it meant that the end of Jim Crow segregation did not come with economic liberation, leaving a very important part of the structure of what we might call racial capitalism intact. And so this helps explain in many ways the situation today, in which obviously class inequality and racial oppression continue very much to be intertwined within the United States. So in some ways then, the Cold War made a kind of more substantive kind of liberation off the table, and so therefore had a negative impact. So we can talk about this this debate. Okay, you can see I've circled around a little bit through the jewelry quarter. This part's a bit noisy. I think I'm ready to stop here. So, and maybe I'll turn the camera around for a second. So thanks for coming with me on this bike ride. I'm looking really forward to talking about a couple of examples, a speech from Kennedy, a speech from Khrushchev in class, and talking about homophobia, moving away from some of that really kind of formal diplomatic history we looked at before, and in seminar looking at homophobia across what we might call and what we might critique as the Iron Curtain. Okay, thanks everybody. See you in class.